The red and blue lights were already washing over the water by the time I stepped out onto the porch. They didn't scream the way sirens do in movies. They pulsed, slow, deliberate, bright enough to scatter across the lake and bounce off the glassy surface like something artificial intruding on a quiet place that wasn't built for noise. The cabin had seen storms, winters, long stretches of silence, but police lights were new. They painted the trees, the dock, the side of my truck. They painted me. A few doors down, porch lights clicked on one by one. Curtains shifted. Someone's garage door froze halfway up, then slowly lowered again. That familiar human instinct kicked in, people wanting to see without being seen. A woman's voice cut through it all. "He does not belong here." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It had the tone of someone who believed the sentence alone should be enough to make reality rearrange itself. She stood near the end of my gravel drive, arms crossed, posture rigid, well-dressed, purposefully so, the kind of outfit people wear when they expect to be taken seriously. Pressed slacks, tailored jacket, hair styled in a way that said this wasn't a coincidence encounter. This was planned, prepared, executed. One of the officers turned slightly toward her, not interrupting, just listening. The other stood closer to me, hands relaxed, neutral stance. No one was in a rush. That detail mattered more than anyone realized. "He's squatting," the woman continued, gesturing broadly toward the cabin behind me. "This structure is not compliant. It violates community standards, zoning expectations, and safety regulations. I've told him repeatedly he needs to vacate." The words came out clean, practiced, almost rehearsed. The officer nodded once, not agreement, acknowledgement. A subtle difference people who rely on authority often miss. "Ma'am," he said, "can you show me documentation that he's trespassing?" She didn't hesitate, not even a flicker of uncertainty. "He doesn't have permission to be here." The officer waited. "I'm asking for proof of ownership or lack thereof," he clarified. Calm, even, boring, in the way procedure always is. She exhaled sharply, like someone annoyed that a conversation wasn't moving at the speed she expected. "This is part of Clearwater Estates. We have an association. There are rules. That cabin does not meet them." Behind her, someone whispered. A neighbor, maybe. Hard to tell. The lake carried sound in strange ways. The officer didn't turn around. "Rules aren't ownership," he said. "Do you have paperwork showing this property isn't his?" Her jaw tightened. "I'm the president of the homeowners association." She said it like it should end the discussion. It didn't. The other officer finally spoke. "Okay. Are you saying you personally own this property?" "No." "Does the association own it?" "No, but..." "Then we need something that shows he's here illegally." Her eyes flicked toward me for the first time. Not a glare. Something sharper. Calculation. I hadn't said a word yet. That bothered her. She turned back to the officers. "This is exactly the problem. People like this move in and think they can ignore the standards everyone else follows. We've had issues before. I warned him. I gave him notices. He refused to comply." "What kind of notices?" the first officer asked. "Compliance notices. Aesthetic violations, unauthorized use." He nodded again. "Those are civil matters." Her voice rose a fraction. "He is disturbing the peace." The officer glanced toward the lake, still and quiet. No music, no shouting, no signs of anything resembling a disturbance. Just a cabin, a dock, and a man standing barefoot on his own porch. "Who called us tonight?" he asked. "I did." "And what was the emergency?" She paused. Just long enough to register as a pause. "He refused to leave when instructed." "Instructed by whom?" "By the association." The officer exhaled slowly, the way people do when they already know where a conversation is going but still have to walk it there step by step. "Ma'am, unless there's a court order, eviction notice, or proof of trespassing, we can't remove someone from a property they claim to own." She folded her arms tighter. "So, you're just going to let him stay? We're going to verify ownership?" She scoffed. "I don't need verification. I know he doesn't belong." The officer turned to me for the first time. "Sir, do you have identification and any proof this is your property?" I stepped inside for a moment and came back with a folder. It wasn't dramatic, no flourish, just paper, worn edges, tabs sticking out where I'd labeled things months ago, long before this night. I handed it to him. He flipped through slowly. Deed, tax records, utility statements, the kind of documents that don't raise their voice because they don't need to. Behind him, her breathing changed. Sharper now, faster. "That doesn't mean anything," she said quickly. "That structure predates the association, but that doesn't exempt it from standards. He's refusing to modernize. It affects property values." The officer kept reading. "This deed's recorded with the county." "Yes, but, and taxes are current. That's not the issue." He closed the folder. "Ma'am, based on what I'm seeing, he's legally allowed to be here." Her composure cracked. Not dramatically, not explosively, but enough. "This is unbelievable. So anyone can just ignore community rules?" The officer chose his words carefully. HOA disputes are handled in civil court. Calling 911 doesn't change ownership. Around us, a few neighbors drifted closer, pretending to check mailboxes, walk dogs that didn't need walking. They were listening now, watching the shift happen in real time. She tried again. "He's non-compliant. He's a problem." The officer's voice stayed level. "That doesn't make him a criminal." Silence settled in. The lake seemed to hold its breath with it. Finally, she straightened her jacket and forced a thin smile. "Fine, then we'll handle this properly." "That's probably best," he said. As the officers handed my folder back, the lights shut off one by one. Red disappeared. Blue followed. The night returned to itself. Before leaving, one of them looked at me and said quietly, "If this continues, keep documenting, and don't hesitate to call us if someone's trespassing on your property." She heard that. Her eyes met mine again. Not angry now. Something else. Unsettled. She turned and walked away without another word. The neighbors slowly retreated. Doors closed. Curtains fell back into place. The lake went dark again, reflecting only moonlight this time. I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the quiet reclaim the space where authority had tried, and failed, to assert itself. She had been certain, absolutely convinced that confidence alone would carry the night. But confidence isn't proof. She kept saying she had authority. The officer kept asking for paperwork. By the time the patrol cars were gone, the lake went still again. The cabin looked exactly the way it always had. Quiet, unbothered, unconcerned with the drama that had just tried to anchor itself to its doorstep. That was the thing about this place. It had a way of outlasting noise. If you stood at the end of the gravel drive and looked around, the contrast was impossible to miss. On one side, the cabin sat low to the ground, its cedar siding darkened by decades of sun, rain, and winters that didn't care about aesthetics. The porch rail had been sanded smooth by hands that didn't rush. The steps dipped slightly in the middle, not from neglect but from use. Real use, generations of it. Fishing boots, coolers, bare feet running in from the water. Across the narrow stretch of shoreline, everything else gleamed. Tall houses rose up where trees had once stood. Clean angles, white. Stone facades. Black-framed windows that reflected the lake but never seemed to belong to it. Landscapes trimmed so precisely they looked paused, like nothing was allowed to grow unless it had permission. Even the docks were identical. Wide, polished, uniform. Designed less for fishing and more for photos. The cabin didn't match any of it. That was the problem, apparently. But the cabin had been there first. Long before design boards, compliance notices, or community standards ever learned the name of this lake. Long before anyone thought to call the shoreline prime real estate. Back when it was just water, trees, and people who didn't lock their doors because no one had anything worth stealing. The original structure went up in 1946. No blueprints on file. No architectural renderings. Just a man, some lumber, and a piece of land he'd bought outright after coming home from a war he didn't talk about. He built it the way people used to build things, slowly, deliberately, with the understanding that it wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was meant to last. Over the years, the cabin changed in small ways. A new roof after a brutal winter. Reinforced beams when the original posts began to bow, electricity added, plumbing upgraded. Nothing flashy, nothing unnecessary. Every improvement had a reason, and every reason traced back to function, not appearance. The lake changed too, gradually at first. A paved road where a dirt path used to be, a few more boats each summer. Then suddenly, everything accelerated. Land parcels were sold, developers arrived with renderings and promises. Bulldozers replaced birdsong, trees fell, foundations went in, and then the houses came. 30 of them, give or take. Big, expensive, designed to signal success to anyone driving by, each one more polished than the last. Together, they formed something cohesive, intentional, and unmistakably new. Clearwater Estates, they called it. The name itself told you who it was for. The cabin, by contrast, didn't have a name. It didn't need one. It was just there. Had always been there, watching the shoreline fill in around it like water rising around a rock that refused to move. That refusal wasn't stubbornness. It was history. When Clearwater Estates was officially formed, the paperwork went through in 2012. Covenants were drafted. Boards were elected. Rules were written to maintain uniformity, protect investments, and preserve a certain image. Paint colors were approved. Fence heights were standardized. Landscaping guidelines were enforced down to the inch. All of it made sense if you were starting from scratch. The problem was that the cabin wasn't part of the start. It sat on its own parcel, deeded separately, recorded decades earlier. It had survived rezoning efforts, shoreline adjustments, and more than one attempt to buy it out quietly. Every time someone tried, the answer was the same: no. Not because the owners were difficult, but because the place meant something. You don't measure that in square footage or resale value. You feel it when you walk across a floor that creaks in familiar places, when you open a door that's been opened thousands of times before and still fits its frame perfectly. From the water, the difference was even more striking. If you approached by boat, the cabin didn't announce itself. It didn't rise above the tree line or reflect the sun. It blended in, a dark silhouette against the green, tucked into the shoreline like it belonged there because it did. The houses behind it looked like visitors. That irony never sat well with people who valued control. From the moment Clearwater Estates filled up, the cabin became an inconvenience, a visual outlier, something that broke the illusion of uniform success. You could see it from certain decks, from certain windows, a reminder that not everything could be curated. At first it was ignored, then it was discussed, then it was noticed. Comments started circulating. Quiet ones, questions framed as concerns. Was it up to code? Was it safe? Why didn't it match the rest of the community? No one asked who had been there longer. No one asked what rights came with that. They just assumed that newer meant stronger. Standing on the dock, you could hear the difference too. The cabin had sounds that came naturally. Whined through trees, water lapping against old wood, a screen door closing gently. The houses made different noises, mechanical ones, garage doors, pool pumps, security systems chirping when someone forgot a code. Even the light behaved differently. At night, the cabin glowed softly, warm, yellow, contained. The houses blasted white light across manicured lawns, illuminating everything but warmth. The cabin didn't try to compete. It didn't upgrade to fit in. It stayed what it was. And that, more than anything else, made it suspicious. Because when something refuses to change, people start to wonder why. They look for a reason, a flaw, a loophole, something they can point to and say, "There, that's the problem." That's when the association entered. The picture, not with hostility at first, just interest, inquiries, friendly reminders, suggestions framed as help, paint recommendations, landscaping ideas, offers to bring the property into alignment. They always use that phrase, alignment, as if the cabin were crooked, as if time itself had somehow bent it out of shape. But alignment only works if everyone agrees on the direction. The cabin wasn't resisting progress. It simply wasn't part of it. That distinction mattered legally, historically, and practically. It mattered in county records, in zoning maps, in deed language written long before anyone imagined a homeowners association governing a lake that had once been nothing more than a fishing spot and a quiet retreat. Those documents existed whether anyone liked them or not. That's what made the situation uncomfortable. You can argue taste, you can argue value, you can even argue aesthetics. But arguing with recorded history is harder, especially when it's written in ink, filed in drawers, and stamped by offices that don't care how confident you sound. The HOA was created in 2012. This cabin was built in 1946. That single fact sat beneath everything that followed, even when no one wanted to acknowledge it. It explained the tension, the fixation, the urgency to assert control where control didn't naturally exist. The cabin wasn't a violation, it was a reminder that land remembers longer than people do, that authority has boundaries, that not everything can be standardized without erasing something real. And for those who needed the world to be orderly, symmetrical, and compliant, the cabin's quiet refusal to disappear became something confrontational. But it was consistent, intentional, observation disguised as concern. Then came the third notice. This one was taped to the door in broad daylight. No envelope, no attempt at discretion. It cited documented non-compliance and referenced complaints from other residents. It mentioned noise, visual disruption, unauthorized structures. Unauthorized, that word stuck. The structure had been there since before most of the complaints authors had been born. Still, the notice ended the same way the others did, cordial, professional, signed by the same name each time. That was when I finally looked her up. President of the association, long-time resident, real estate background, board elected, well-connected, the kind of person who showed up in community newsletters smiling beside ribbon cuttings and charity events. The kind of person people deferred to without thinking about why. Her approach made more sense after that. This wasn't emotional. It was procedural. She wasn't angry. She was methodical. The next escalation wasn't paper. It was presence. One morning, while I was repairing a loose board on the dock, a man in a reflective vest approached from the road. He didn't introduce himself, just stood at a distance and watched. When I looked up, he pointed at the cabin and made notes on a clipboard. "Can I help you?" I asked. "I'm just observing," he said. "For whom?" He hesitated. "The association. What are you observing?" "General compliance." "With what?" He didn't answer, just nodded, scribbled something else and walked away. Later that afternoon, another complaint appeared in the mailbox. This one mentioned an unapproved modificate. Ion to the dock. The board I'd replaced was identical to the one that had rotted. Same dimensions, same material, same function, still unauthorized. The pattern became clear. Each step was slightly more intrusive than the last, but never dramatic enough to justify confrontation. Each action was framed as responsibility, not aggression. Oversight, not harassment. That's how pressure works when it wants to look reasonable. Soon, county vehicles started showing up. Inspectors, environmental officers, people doing their jobs, responding to anonymous tips. Septic concerns, shoreline runoff, safety compliance. Every inspection ended the same way: documentation reviewed, systems certified, no violations found. Each time the inspectors left apologetic, slightly embarrassed, aware they'd been used but bound to follow procedure anyway. The complaints didn't stop, they just changed shape. Early morning noise reports, claims of commercial activity, allegations that the cabin was being rented illegally, all untrue, all unverifiable, all logged. And every time the result was the same: no action taken, no enforcement, no follow-up. What changed was the frequency. The association's patrols became more visible. 2 vehicles now, slower passes, occasional stops near the drive, someone taking photos openly this time, not bothering to hide it. One afternoon, I found a notice taped to the dock post itself, laminated, waterproof, stating that the structure was under review and advising against continued use pending compliance verification. It wasn't signed by the county. It wasn't signed by anyone with jurisdiction. It was just there. I removed it and set it aside. That evening she showed up in person. No announcement, no appointment. She walked up the gravel drive like she owned it, phone in hand, eyes scanning. She stopped a few feet from the porch and looked around slowly, deliberately. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she said, gesturing toward the cabin. "About what?" I asked. "The condition, the appearance. It doesn't meet community expectations. I'm not part of the community." She smiled, thin, controlled. "You live here. I own this property. That doesn't exempt you from standards." "Actually," I said, "it does." Her smile didn't change, but something behind it did. "We'll see." She left without another word. 2 days later, the patrol vehicles returned. This time, they stopped at the end of the drive. Doors opened, phones came out, photos were taken, conversations were had within earshot. No one spoke to me directly. That night, someone left a handwritten note on the porch. No letterhead, no signature, just a warning. People are watching. The next morning, the 911 call happened. I didn't hear the sirens until they were already turning in. I didn't know who had called until she stepped forward and began explaining the situation with practiced urgency. "He doesn't belong here." By then, the pattern was complete. Not one action on its own crossed a clear line, but together they formed something unmistakable, a steady escalation designed to exhaust, intimidate, and eventually force compliance or departure. Each attempt relied on the same assumption, that authority, when asserted confidently enough, would become real. Each attempt failed for the same reason. Paper doesn't care about confidence. Every complaint triggered a review. Every review ended with the same conclusion: no violation, no jurisdiction, no action. That's when frustration started leaking through the professionalism, not anger, impatience. The notices became more frequent, the language sharper, the timelines shorter, the stakes inflated. But the foundation never changed. There was no legal basis, no enforceable claim, no ownership, just insistence. And insistence, no matter how persistent, doesn't turn into truth just because someone wants it to. By the time the police lights reflected off the lake that night, it wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about forcing an outcome when all other tools had failed. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't insult me, she didn't threaten violence or make wild accusations. She just kept escalating, slightly, carefully, assuming that eventually something would stick. It didn't, and the more it failed, the clearer it became to everyone watching. Not because she was loud, but because she wouldn't stop. After the patrol cars stopped coming as often, something quieter took their place. Paper. Not dramatic paper. Not envelopes stamped in red or thick packets designed to intimidate. Just documents doing what documents do, existing patiently, waiting to be read by the right person. I didn't escalate. I didn't argue in public meetings or post rebuttals online. I didn't match volume with volume. I organized. Every notice that came in went into a folder, dates logged, language highlighted, claims cross-referenced. When inspectors visited, I asked for business cards and wrote down case numbers. When complaints were filed, I requested copies. When assumptions were made, I pulled records. The cabin had a history, and history leaves a paper trail whether people acknowledge it or not. The original deed was handwritten. Faded ink. County stamp barely visible at the corner. It referenced landmarks that no longer existed. An oak tree that had fallen decades ago, a fence line replaced by asphalt. But it was recorded. That mattered. The parcel number didn't change just because the neighborhood around it did. Then there were the tax records, continuous, uninterrupted, year after year, paid on time, no gaps, no transfers, no liens. The county didn't care about community standards. It cared about who owed what and whether it was paid. The permits came next. Electrical upgrades, septic certification, structural reinforcement. Each improvement logged, inspected, approved. Quiet proof that the cabin wasn't some forgotten relic barely holding together, but a maintained residence that met the rules that actually applied to it. And then there was the clause most people never think to look for. Grandfathered use. It wasn't bolded. It wasn't dramatic. It was a paragraph buried in zoning language, written in plain terms decades ago, long before anyone imagined a gated community defining itself by uniformity. It stated, simply, that structures legally established prior to the enactment of new regulations were exempt from those regulations unless they posed a demonstrable safety hazard. Not aesthetic discomfort, not property value anxiety, safety, that clause had teeth. Every time a new complaint surfaced, noise, lighting, dock usage, I pulled the same documents and responded the same way. Calm, direct, with copies attached. The responses weren't emotional. They weren't defensive. They didn't accuse anyone of harassment. They just stated facts. This property predates the association. This structure is legally permitted. This activity is grandfathered and compliant with county regulations. That was it. The replies always came back slower. At first, they were dismissive. Requests for clarification. Suggestions that the association would review the matter further. Language designed to imply authority without confirming it. Then the tone shifted. Deadlines appeared. Citations of bylaws that didn't apply, references to sections that governed association members only, attempts to stretch jurisdiction just far enough to touch the cabin. Each time the answer was the same. Those bylaws don't apply here. This parcel is not subject to association authority. Please provide legal justification if you believe otherwise. No one ever did. What changed instead was the frustration. It showed up in the margins, in hastily added notes, in emails sent late at night, in the sudden urgency of follow-ups that hadn't existed before, where the first notices had been polished. The later ones felt rushed, less confident, more insistent. She began copying more people on emails, board members, attorneys, county officers, anyone she thought might add weight simply by being included. But weight doesn't come from volume. It comes from relevance. County officials responded politely and closed cases. Inspectors confirmed prior findings. Legal counsel asked for documentation that never materialized. Every accusation came with confidence. Every defense came with records. That contrast grew harder to ignore. Dury. NG. One inspection. An environmental officer flipped through the septic certification and paused. "This is more current than most of what we see out here," he said, not unkindly. Another time, a zoning official laughed quietly when I handed over the deed. "This place was here before half of this county figured out what zoning was," he said. Those moments mattered, not because they were victories, but because they reinforced something fundamental. Systems respond to inputs, not tone. The more the association pushed, the more documentation was requested. The more documentation was requested, the more obvious the gap became between assertion and authority. She began showing up at inspections again, standing a little closer, speaking a little faster, repeating claims even after they'd been addressed. "This is non-conforming," she'd say. "It's legally non-conforming," the inspector would reply, already familiar with the file. "That's not acceptable. It's lawful." Those conversations ended quickly. Paper has a way of draining emotion out of conflict. It reduces everything to what can be proven and what can't. And when one side keeps showing up with binders while the other shows up with certainty, the outcome becomes predictable. Not dramatic, predictable. The association tried one more angle: formal demand letters, heavier envelopes, legal language, threats of action if compliance wasn't achieved. I forwarded them to an attorney. He called me back the same afternoon. "They don't have standing," he said. "They're hoping you don't know that. What should I do?" "Keep doing what you're doing, and stop responding unless they file something official. They never die." D. Instead, the pressure shifted again. More patrols, more whispers, more attempts to turn neighbors into witnesses to something that wasn't happening. But even witnesses need facts. Behind the scenes, the association's frustration grew. Requests for enforcement were denied. Complaints were closed. Files were marked resolved. The cabin stayed. The records accumulated. And slowly something subtle happened. The confidence drained out of the accusations. She still spoke firmly, still carried herself like someone in control. But the rhythm was off. Claims were repeated instead of expanded. Assertions circled instead of advanced. She was saying the same things louder because there was nothing new to say. Meanwhile, the document stayed exactly the same, unchanged, unimpressed. When you strip a conflict down to paper, emotion has nowhere to hide. It can't argue, it can't interrupt, it can't intimidate. It just sits there, waiting to be contradicted, and when it isn't, the noise around it starts to sound exactly like what it is: desperation wrapped in confidence. By the time the paperwork started speaking louder than the complaints, something else had already been set in motion, quietly, deliberately, and completely outside the frame of the conflict as everyone else understood it. None of the notices mentioned money. None of the accusations touched finances directly. On the surface, this was about appearance, control, compliance, about who fit and who didn't. But conflicts like this rarely stay on the surface for long. The first hint came in passing, almost unnoticeable. A comment she made during one of the earlier encounters, delivered casually, like it was back. Ground information, rather than strategy. "These properties are significant investments," she'd said, gesturing vaguely toward the houses lining the shore. "People have a lot at stake here." At the time, it sounded like justification. Later, it sounded like something else. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The statement wasn't meant for me. It was meant to remind herself, and anyone listening, that money conferred authority. That investment translated into control. That assumption sat beneath everything she did. What she didn't know was that money had already entered the picture in a way she hadn't anticipated. Quietly, legally, long before the first notice slid under my door. I hadn't moved back to the lake on impulse. The cabin wasn't a retreat or a rebellion. It was a return to a place I understood, to systems I trusted, and to opportunities most people overlooked because they were too busy chasing what looked impressive. Years earlier, when Clearwater Estates was still new and the paint on those houses still smelled fresh, the market shifted. Interest rates moved. Adjustable loans reset. A few homeowners stretched further than they should have, confident that appreciation would cover the gap. It usually does. Until it doesn't. Banks don't like complexity. They don't like managing small, scattered risks. When loans wobble, they package them, they sell them, quietly, at discounts that don't make headlines. That's where I came in. Not visibly, not aggressively. Through a holding company that didn't attract attention. Northern Pine Investments. A name bland enough to disappear into spreadsheets. The kind of entity no one notices because it isn't trying to be noticed. The strategy wasn't predatory. It was patient. Buy distressed notes, service them properly, let homeowners stabilize if they could, foreclose only when the numbers left no alternative. No drama, no rushing, just math and time. Clearwater Estates appeared on a list one quarter, then again the next. A handful of properties, then a few more. The pattern was familiar: high-end development, over-leveraged buyers, rising dues, special assessments no one planned for. Risk accumulates quietly before it becomes visible. By the time I decided to move back into the cabin, Northern Pine already held interests in the area. Nothing obvious, nothing controlling, just paper, again, waiting. That context made the conflict feel strange from the beginning, not threatening, not personal, almost ironic, in a way that was hard to articulate without saying too much. Every time she spoke about protecting property values, it landed differently. Every time she referenced financial harm or community investment, there was a gap between what she thought she understood and what actually existed. I never corrected her. There was no reason to. The more she escalated, the more she relied on assumptions that only held up if no one checked beneath them. Authority, influence, standing. Those things feel solid until they're measured. During one inspection, while flipping through paperwork, an official mentioned how many parcels in the area were under similar financial pressure. "A lot of adjustable loans out here," he said, almost conversationally. "People bought at the peak." She was standing nearby. I noticed the way her posture stiffened, just slightly, like someone hearing a sound they weren't expecting. Later, at a board meeting I wasn't supposed to attend, she spoke at length about budget shortfalls, about the need for increased dues, about protecting the association's financial health. She spoke confidently, persuasively. But there was urgency there too, an edge that hadn't been present before. I listened without comment. The irony wasn't sharp yet, it was still forming, like a shadow that only appears when the light hits from the right angle. What mattered was timing. Reveals too early lose their power, too late, and they feel like tricks. The sweet spot is when the audience senses something is off but can't quite name it yet. That's where this sat. She continued treating the conflict as a question of compliance and control, unaware that the foundation she stood on was thinner than she believed. Every action assumed stability, every threat assumed leverage. Meanwhile, leverage doesn't announce itself, it waits. There were moments when I almost said something, when the contrast became obvious enough to feel heavy, when she lectured about responsibility while missing payments elsewhere, when she spoke about community trust while relying on systems she didn't fully understand. But restraint mattered. This wasn't about embarrassment, it wasn't about revenge, it wasn't even about winning. It was about letting truth surface on its own, in the only way that ever sticks, through records, timing, and inevitability. So I kept quiet. I kept organizing paperwork. I kept responding calmly. I kept documenting everything. And she kept escalating, unaware that the ground beneath her confidence wasn't solid. It was mortgaged. The lake stayed calm through all of it. Boats came and went. Summer edged closer. The cabin remained exactly where it had always been. From the outside, nothing looked different, but beneath the surface, the math was already working. What she didn't know was that I'd been investing quietly in the area, long before I moved back, and by the time she realized there was more to this than a cabin that didn't fit the aesthetic, the numbers would already be speaking for themselves, not loudly, just clearly. The call didn't start with shouting. It didn't start with threats or panic or anything that would later justify the reaction it caused. It started with certainty, a calm voice on the other end of the line, confident enough to sound credible, explaining that there was a situation at the lake, that someone was occupying a property they shouldn't be, that it was escalating, that it needed to be handled now. Emergency services are trained to listen for chaos. What they got instead was composure. That tends to move things faster than yelling ever could. By the time the patrol cars turned onto the Lakeside road, the narrative had already been shaped. Not dramatically, not dishonestly, just selectively. Enough to warrant a response, enough to justify lights, enough to involve authority in a dispute that had so far refused to be resolved by paperwork alone. The neighbors noticed immediately. Sirens travel far over water, so do assumptions. People stepped outside. Phones came out. Someone whispered that something serious must be happening this time, that it had finally gone too far, that the association must have proof now. The officers arrived without urgency, but with purpose. They parked where they could be seen. Visibility matters when a situation has already drawn an audience. She was waiting for them, not pacing, not agitated, standing upright near the edge of the drive, phone LL in hand, prepared to explain. She didn't rush toward them. She let them come to her. That detail mattered too. When she spoke, it was measured, controlled, professional. She explained that there had been ongoing issues, that this wasn't sudden, that attempts had been made to resolve things civilly, that the individual in question had refused to comply with community standards and had now become disruptive. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult me. She didn't exaggerate events. She framed it as procedure. The officers listened. One asked clarifying questions. The other scanned the property, the cabin, the dock, the shoreline. No signs of disturbance, no gathering, no activity that matched the urgency of the call. They asked what the immediate issue was. She said I refused to leave. They asked why I should leave. She said I didn't belong there. They asked how she knew. That's where the tone shifted, not sharply but perceptibly. She referenced her role, the association, the rules, the violations, the notices, the history of non-compliance. She spoke as though repetition itself would harden the claims into fact. The officers nodded, took notes, asked for documentation. She gestured toward the cabin, toward the lake, toward the surrounding homes. It wasn't enough. They turned to me next. The questions were straightforward. Identification, proof of residence, any documentation supporting ownership. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I handed over the folder. That moment always feels longer than it is. Paper changes the energy in a space. It slows everything down. It demands attention in a way voices don't. As the officer flipped through the document, TS, the dynamic shifted again. Quietly, subtly, but unmistakably. Dates were read. Parcel numbers checked. Names matched. He didn't react outwardly, just kept turning pages. She continued talking in the background, filling the silence, reiterating concerns, emphasizing disruption, stressing urgency. The officer raised a hand, not dismissively, just enough to pause her. "Ma'am," he said, "I need a moment." That pause did something the notices never had. People watching from a distance leaned in without realizing it. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones lowered slightly. The officer closed the folder and asked a question that hadn't come up before. "You said this property was part of the association?" "Yes," she replied quickly. "It's surrounded by it." "Surrounded isn't the same as included." She frowned. "It should be, but is it?" She didn't answer immediately. He asked for the association's boundary documentation. She said she didn't have it with her. He asked if there was a court order or eviction notice. There wasn't. He asked if there was a criminal complaint beyond non-compliance with association rules. There wasn't. At that point, the conversation changed direction. Not confrontational. Procedural. "This appears to be a civil matter," he said. "We can't remove someone from a property they own without legal documentation." She protested. Not loudly, but persistently. She insisted the rules applied, that allowing this to continue would set a precedent, that the community was at risk. He listened, then explained something she didn't want to hear. HOA authority doesn't override property law. The other officer added, "If you believe there's a violation, that's something to take up in civil court. Calling emergency services isn't the right channel." The words landed heavier than their volume suggested, because they were said in front of witnesses. Not as a rebuke, as a clarification. That distinction mattered. No one was embarrassed, no one was scolded. But the narrative she'd built began to dissolve under the weight of procedure. She tried one last angle. She asked whether I could be asked to leave temporarily while things were sorted out. The answer was immediate. No, clear, neutral, final. The officers returned my documents and asked if I wanted to file a report regarding the repeated complaints. I declined. Not because there wasn't a case, because timing matters. As they prepared to leave, one of them turned back to her. "If this continues," he said, "we may need to look into misuse of emergency services." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of policy. That was when the crowd began to disperse. Slowly, quietly. People retreating with new information to process. The lights shut off. The engines started. The lake absorbed the sound like it always did. She stood there a moment longer, watching the patrol cars disappear. No outburst, no final words, just stillness. But something had changed, because emergency calls don't exist in isolation. They generate records, timestamps, incident numbers, cross-references. That night didn't end with sirens or citations. It ended with a paper trail that extended beyond the association's reach. The call had forced something she couldn't control. Verification, not just of ownership, of history. Boundaries. Of claims that had been repeated so often they'd never been questioned. Emergency services follow up. Counties review. Files get pulled. One call becomes a trigger for others, and that call triggered a record search she never expected. The truth didn't come out in a dramatic moment. There was no gasp, no crowd reaction, no sudden shift in music or tone. It emerged the way real consequences usually do, quietly, through documents, timelines, and facts that don't care how confident someone sounds when they speak. After the patrol cars left, things went very still, not peaceful exactly, just suspended. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone realizes the situation didn't end the way they expected, but no one is ready to talk about it yet. For a few weeks after that call, nothing obvious happened. No more notices taped to the door, no more courtesy warnings, no one walking the property line with a clipboard. From the outside, it might have looked like the issue had resolved itself. It hadn't. Behind the scenes, the call had done what emergency calls always do. It created a record, a timestamp, a reason for multiple offices to look at the same parcel at the same time. The county pulled the property file to confirm ownership. That led to zoning. Zoning led to boundary verification. Boundary verification led to association maps being cross-checked against recorded deeds. And that's when the problem stopped being about me, because when those records were laid side by side, something didn't line up. The association's claimed boundary included properties it didn't legally govern. Not aggressively, not maliciously, just conveniently. Over time, maps had been redrawn. Language softened. Assumptions hardened into policy. Most people never question it. They pay their dues. They follow the letters. They assume the authority is legitimate because it's always been there. That assumption works until it doesn't. During that review, ownership structures surfaced. LLCs, trusts, long-term leases, investment holdings. The kind of things no one pays attention to until paperwork forces them to. That's when her name appeared again. Not as an enforcer, not as a board member, as a tenant, not of the cabin, of one of the newer homes uphill, one of the ones that had gone up after the association was formed, one of the ones that paid monthly, on time, through a management company that handled things quietly and professionally, a management company I happened to own. I didn't move back to the lake on a whim. I hadn't been absent. I'd been patient, investing quietly, letting the area grow, letting others take the spotlight while I stayed in the background. I never needed to announce it. The checks cleared either way. She had never seen my name because she didn't need to. She interacted with policies, not people, with authority symbols, not ownership chains. When the county contacted the association for clarification, they also contacted the registered property managers tied to several parcels in question. That's when my phone rang. Not with anger, not with accusation, with confusion. A compliance officer wanted to confirm whether the cabin was owner-occupied. I said yes. They asked whether I also managed other properties in the development. I said yes. They asked whether one of those properties was leased to a current board member. I paused, not for effect, but because the question deserved precision. Yes, I said, through the management company. There was silence on the line, not shock, recognition. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No apology, no confrontation, no scene. What happened instead was paperwork. The association revised its boundary language. Quietly, notices stopped going out. A few policies were updated. A meeting was held without much publicity. A new compliance process was introduced that emphasized verification before enforcement. She resigned from the board 2 months later. Not publicly, not as a statement. Her name simply wasn't on the agenda anymore. Rent continued to be paid, on time, every month. I didn't raise it, not to her, not to anyone, because the point was never to win. It was to show how fragile authority becomes when it's built on assumption instead of law. She didn't know she was paying me because she never thought to ask who actually owned the ground she stood on. She believed authority came from position, from repetition, from confidence delivered without hesitation. And for a long time, that belief worked. Until it didn't. The cabin is still there. Same weathered wood, same quiet mornings, same contrast against the polished homes that grew up around it. Nothing about it changed, except the way it was seen. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now wave. Some ask questions, others just listen more carefully when rules are explained to them. Because this wasn't about one person being wrong. It was about how easily confidence gets mistaken for power. How often people assume paperwork exists because someone speaks like it does. How rarely anyone asks to see it until a moment forces the question. She called 911 because she thought authority was something you could assert loudly enough to make it real. She learned it comes from paperwork, and that's the part that lingers. The reason people replay the story, The reason they comment, argue, share their own experiences, because somewhere, in almost every community, there's someone enforcing rules they've never verified. Someone convinced they're untouchable because no one has challenged them yet. Until one day they do. She called 911 to remove me, not knowing she'd been paying me every month.